All right, we are on lesson number 8, entitled I Was Alone. And so, we get now really clearly in the embedded narrative, right, the third person's story. And so the way that the narrative is framed again is this is Walton's retelling of Victor's conversation about what happened. And now we're at the point of it's the monster telling Victor, telling Walton what's going on. Is everyone tracking with that? And so it's right now we're at the place where the monster is telling Victor, and that's in past tense. That happened in past tense. But now in present tense, it's Victor telling Walton what happened with the monster story. And so it can be very confusing, but again, the beauty of this style of writing is with the embedded narrative, it makes it more believable. And so this is the story of somebody's story. And so it brings us into the world of like, you're getting secondhand knowledge of this event that happened. And so you're almost being invited into this intimate relationship or context, right? And remember that Walton, his whole pursuit was to get to the North Pole and to pursue knowledge and all of these things. And it is in the life of Victor Frankenstein that we see the story being retold basically to Walton of like, this is why that mindset is wrong. And the way he recounts the whole story is he's given the full story. And really he's finally kind of coming to a place of responsibility where he indicates it was really a lot of fault was on him, certainly. And so, as we've been following along, we want to be really, really clear about who this character is, right? The creature, the monster, the demon. Those are our choices, right? Let's take a look. So, if we had to define how we see, I think that's the Old English way of saying it. How do we see this being? So we talked about creature. Being from the mindset of a creature is the same as like a deer or a bird. Those are creatures, right? We, in one sense, as humans, we could say that we're creatures, but the implication here, the choice that we're given is not human. So creature falls short of humanity. So it's something that's been created, but it's other than what we are. The next thing that we get is monster. And so this obviously still means creature, but it's a fallen creature, right? There's something that is evil about it in one sense. It's not good. And so maybe it's not fully evil, but it's certainly not anywhere near good. And then we have the definition of demon, that this is just something that emanates from a totally evil place. So really quickly, let me ask your perspective. How many of you would view the creation here, the being, as being a creature? How many of you would view it as being a monster? How many of you would view it as being a demon? Okay, good. Most of us are falling on the side of creature. Now, I want to ask you to compart, and we're not going to get into this now, but this will be kind of building towards the end. I want you to compart in your mind the answering why, because what we tend to know to be fairly truthful at this point is that this creature has done what? Murdered. And so we have to reconcile that, right? If we're saying it's just a creature, and we're thinking it's more good than it is bad, so what's separate? I mean, murder. Again, you guys get to determine and decide, but let's walk that through in our heart and mind. Somebody who is murdered now, we're putting on a more positive side of the ledger. And so I want to just invite you into that thought. Just let that sit in your mind for a second and try to come to some understanding of why you would define it that way. And it's okay that you do. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. But if I were to ask you that question, if somebody were able to point out and say, well, that thing murdered someone, and not just someone, it wasn't like, he murdered somebody who was robbing a bank. Who did he murder? A little boy, a child, right? And so now this is, again, the author is intentional. There's a lot of like morality kind of struggles here that we're supposed to deal with. And so the real question that I want to get at here, though, is there's a psychological term for why we are the way that we are. And there's two competing thoughts. Let me know if you've ever heard this. It's the conversation of nature versus, does anyone know? Nurture. What is nature? Well, nature is basically, I am the byproduct of just naturally what happens. It's just, we're all human, and so because we're human, we have the ability to love, we have the ability to hate. It's in our DNA, it's who we are. Versus nurturing is something that is taught. And so to nurture would be the way that I care for or teach or train or grow. And so this is much more intentional. And so there's two schools of thought. That number one is that people are basically, because of their nature, because you're human, you'll be a certain way. And there's other people that will argue on the other side saying, no, you're much more who you've been taught to be, nurtured, who you've been nurtured to become, than you are a byproduct of just being human. And so when we look and we analyze the life of, I'll use the term creature because that's where most of us are focused on. When we look at the life of the creature, did that creature become who they were because it was in their nature to be that way? Or was it because they were nurtured? And so the author, what they're doing here is she's introduced us to what? To a family. A whole family unit. And so we see the father figure, right? Delancey. And then we see the older brother and the younger sister. And what is something that marks out this family really clearly? Is it love and affection? Is it kindness and care? Right? We see a fairly functioning family dynamic, right? Now this would be on more of the nurture side of things. What the creature is observing from the outside, looking in as he's gathering wood and doing other things, he's observing culture. How does a family supposed to operate? And again, keeping in mind that he has no context for what a family looks like, right? By nature, what he's learned from Victor is kind of really terrible things, right? Like it's just an assumption that he's a demon, that he's terrible, horrible, that he's just ungodly creation that never should have been created, and there's a separation immediately. And so we see that there's these two competing ideas at work here. Is this creature just destined to be a fiend, hellish, demonic, murderous? Or is this creature capable of being loved and nurtured and cared for? And so the author is giving us, right, when we open the book, what do we see the story of? We see the story in the first chapters, after the letters, because the letters give context to the greater story. But in the first chapters, we see whose childhood story? Victor's. And Victor's childhood story is what? Is it loving, benevolent, kind? Yes. And so it is not any different than we see Delancey and his family, right? We see kind of comparisons, similarities here. And what we see, though, in the life of the creature is that the creature would desire to be an adoptive son in that house. There's a desire, right, in the creature's heart. Because he's been rejected at the hands of his creator, there's a great desire for him to be in relationship. And what he's observing is, man, that would be the thing that I want. There's this playfulness, this love, this affection. And then he notices that there's a culture of honor that's been built up in the house. Because Delancey, right, he is treated with deference, respect, honor. Right? And we pointed out he was blind. And so is that respect and love, is it only because he's blind? No, it's because the position that he holds. And so it's not an affection or a love that's extended to him because he's pitied. Like, poor you. And I think this, again, is intentional in the author's part to give us a character who is flawed, right? Physically flawed. They have an inability to see the world. And yet, as we pointed out earlier, he probably sees the world much more clearly because he's not limited by his perceptions in the natural sense. He has the ability to see beyond. He can hear people. He can ask questions. He doesn't base things off of a physical reality. And so what we're getting at here, I think, in these two chapters is is really the power of relational dynamics. We talked about that a little bit. The first is that we want to discuss is the power of acceptance. Now, I trust that all of us have been outsiders at some point in our life, right? If you've moved cities, you've moved schools, you've moved at all, you know what it's like to be the new kid on the block and to come into something. How many of us have ever had an experience where you came into a new place and then people received you in a really positive way? They accepted you. Now I want you to meditate and think about, what did that feel like in your heart and life? Is that something that settles you and anchors you? And again, getting back to our pyramid, the hierarchy of needs, right? What we know is one of our fundamental needs is to be loved and accepted. This is critical to the way that we see the world around us. And so there is a tremendous power in feeling accepted. In fact, if you want to really bless somebody's life, accepting them is a really good way to do that. And what acceptance does is it anchors us to relationships. And so acceptance doesn't mean I agree with everything, but acceptance is basically this concept of like, I see you for who you are, and regardless of strengths, weaknesses, whatever, I see you as what? Having value as just being a person. And so we live in a culture, by the way, that talks about acceptance from a very perverted understanding. We think of acceptance as you just got to allow people to do whatever. Well, that's not what acceptance is. Acceptance is not, whatever you want to do it. No, the goal is not in our life is not to be accepting, because we don't want to be accepting of evil. But what we need to really clearly discern is there's a difference between who a person is and the things that they do. And in our sense of being humanity, we want to try to accept and love the person. We don't give permission for the ungodliness, the unrighteousness, or the sin. But what tends to happen with most people is we'll either basically just tear people down because they don't meet our standard, or we'll just push them away because they don't meet our standard. And really what is beneficial to all of us is to be able to accept what? Accept that we have similarities, accept that we have differences, and learn to struggle with those. Because sometimes it's in the struggle where we find health, right? And so Victor doesn't give this opportunity for the creature at all, does he? There's no ability for the creature to struggle for a place in Victor's family. He is completely what? It's the second power. If it's not acceptance, it's what?
Rebellion?
No. Rejection. The power of rejection. To be cast out, to be cast aside, to be put under, right? This is the Gothic theme at work. This whole concept of rejection, acceptance. And so we see that what the creature has experienced at the hands of the Creator, Victor, is the power of rejection. It has caused within the creature's heart a desire to experience what? The power of acceptance. Now I want you to think about the significance of this. It's certainly not lost on me. And again, from my upbringing, I know what it's like to be rejected by my earthly father. I know what that feels like. And I won't get into too many details, but I remember the plum-colored car where we were at in East Helena, Montana, and my biological father and my mother were separated at this time, and I remember him shouting at her and saying all sorts of things that at the time as a kid I didn't understand, but as now as an adult I go, I can't believe anyone would say that. And I remember him ripping me through a car window and cursing it because I didn't want to go with him. I was fearful of him and hurt by him, and remember getting pulled through that car door. So I when I say I understand rejection, I'm telling you that is a dark place. But what did that rejection create? And this is the beauty, I think, of God, of the way that God's world works, is that God certainly allowed for that to be my experience. But what has it caused within me? It has caused a really great desire in me to want to find true acceptance. To appreciate. So when we come to the themes of like significant, like the seed of sonship, which we talk about often, for me it is such a revelation. Why? Because I've experienced the power of rejection. But what it does in many ways, because I've come to this understanding culturally, is that has anchored me to the value and the importance, not just for my life, but for your life, in our need to be accepted. And how do we receive that acceptance? You see, the way the world teaches acceptance is by doing things to garner attention, to garner love. And so it's not really truly acceptance. It's basically we do things that we know we shouldn't do in order to be welcomed in. And so really in many ways we sacrifice who we truly are by nature. And by nature our understanding would be we are called sons of God. And so we will sacrifice by nature to give over to the nurture of the world, the teachings of the world. And this is in many ways the wrestling that the creature is having to go on, because his desire here is so desperately to want to be connected to this family. So passionately. And yet we know that this story is not going to end well for him. This is tragic. And again, this is why this can be a really hard read if we take a measured approach to it. Because don't you, I mean, I know in my heart, I've read it multiple times, and every time I read it, I want the creature to be vindicated and loved and accepted. I want to, even though I know how it ends, I want to flip the page and see that DeLacy accepts him in and puts his hands up to his kids and says, no, this is a brother that we should welcome. There's this hope, right, that is unrealized here in the story. And let's pause with that for a moment, because that's exactly what we should be feeling. And it's intentional on the author's part. And we see this beautiful story of this beautiful family and this longing to be a part of it. And it comes to a frustration. And what that should cause for us to do is to reflect upon, I think first of all, reflect upon what we have. It's so easy, particularly in your guys' stage of life, to look at your life and think that it's missing something somehow. If only I had this thing or that thing or whatever. And yet, there's so much to what you guys have that is just foundationally a blessing for you. That could just be taken for granted, quite honestly. It could be. And I say that again, not to be critical, because I know your age group, it's a struggle. Life is, you're learning all sorts of things, and how do I become in the world, and what am I going to do with all of those things are floating around. But let's just pause for a moment and realize the position that we're in is not much different here than the creature. Isn't basically what you guys want, and correct me if I'm wrong, is to be loved and accepted and cared for and respected and be invited into relationship. Is that safe to say? When it comes to your peer group, don't you want your peers to like things that you like, or at least validate? They may not like it exactly, but at least validate that you do and make it important to them, even if it's like, I don't really love that. But for them not to say, well, that's dumb, why do you do it? No, but them to say, man, I really love that you love it. And so because you love it, I want to be in the mix with you. And not in a fake, false way, but in a genuine way where you care about that person's heart. And hopefully what that's doing is it's going deeper than just the things that you like in life. Hopefully what you're beginning to cultivate in your life are the deeper things of the Lord. And those things should be priorities. Your life should be defined by what does the Lord have in store for the relationships you have. And then on top of that, it can be, cars, movies, whatever. That all of that can be involved as long as they're appropriate. But if what's at the center is not the culture of God's house, right? The identity, the nature of sonship. What we then are left with, if we're not left with the image and likeness of God, is a counterfeit. And you have the enemy of your soul who is trying to nurture you towards wrong thinking. This fully is represented here, by the way, interestingly enough, in the story of Adam and Eve. The enemy comes to Adam and Eve and says, "Did God really say?" And he sows what? Seeds of doubt, seeds of rebellion. The orphan spirit, the independent spirit. And so obviously the author here is not thinking from a purely like spiritual perspective. But again, this is where I think the Lord has led us specifically to read this book. Because I think if we take a look at the life of the creature, we can benefit from it greatly. Let's turn open to chapter 7. Let's go page 134. And we're going to reflect a little bit on some of the story here again of Adam and Eve. Now, the way that this was written wouldn't have been coming from necessarily a biblical perspective of Adam and Eve. Remember, the creature here indicates that he found Paradise Lost. So I would not recommend anyone to read Paradise Lost here until you're a little bit older and more mature in your understandings of the Lord, because Paradise Lost does not accurately represent the heart of God. It basically makes Satan a sympathetic character, like poor Satan got kicked out of heaven. And the demon here, and I'll use that terminology, the demon, because that's the demonic side of the creature here, begins to identify himself with Lucifer as being fallen. And this is where, again, this whole question of creature, monster, or demon comes into play, where we really have to wrestle with how we come to an understanding of that. It says this, "But it was all a dream. No Eve soothed my sorrows, nor shared my thoughts." Now, who's the demon here alluding to his life to, comparing his life to? There was no Eve who soothed my sorrows. Right. And so he's seeing himself, he's picturing himself as an Adam. Right? Page 134. He's created. And he says this, "I was alone." Now, why is that significant? What does the Bible say about aloneness? It is not good for a man to be alone. From the earliest part of creation, we see that. Now, there's a couple of implications that we need to understand culturally. Before Eve came onto the scene, was Adam alone?
No.
Why?
He had God.
He had the Father. And this is a great deception for many, is that we see that Adam was lacking something. Adam was lacking nothing. He had everything he needed with the Father. But Adam began to observe in naming animals and seeing all animals had a kind that was comparable. And so Adam desired something comparable. And I think Adam, in a great deal, missed the opportunity there. Not that I don't think God would have brought Eve. I think God's intention would have always brought that. But there was kind of this wrong-headed mindset for there to be somebody comparable to me, and kind of avoiding some of that dynamic as a son. I don't think Adam fully rooted himself in the reality of a son. And so when Eve comes, that's a blessing to him, certainly. And so we see here that the creature is making this comparison and saying, "I was alone. Like, I didn't even get an Eve." And this is an important theme that we're going to get at. And so in the creature's heart right now, he's like, I deserve to have something. Like, I look at creation, the story of creation, and everything that was created got its own kind. And so he's going beyond just the desire to have a family to be adopted into. What he's desiring is one who is like him. "I remembered Adam's supplication to his creator, but where was mine? He had abandoned me, and in the bitterness of my heart, I cursed him. Let me ask you, is this response justified? When I say justified, is this a good response? Is this okay? Well, it's okay in one sense, and I would agree with the sentiment no, generally. It's okay in this sense. Is it okay for the creature to feel this way? Yes. But again, without understanding his true nature, right? Without the love and affection of a father, what he's learned to do is that there is no release from the emotion that I feel. And so I have to act on my emotion. Where a healthy father would come into your life and say, listen, just because you feel something to be a certain way doesn't make it true. Just because I experienced actual rejection by my earthly father did not make that my reality. I spent years and years of my life wasted. And what I know now is I was never rejected by my true father. I had exalted my earthly father to a position he never should have been in. He was going to fail me. Inevitably. Where my heavenly Father has never. And so, because of the story in which the Lord decided to author my life, I now can come at this perspective, which for me is earth-shattering and world-changing, is that I don't need to hold any earthly person up to a standard of being something for me. I want acceptance, certainly want acceptance from my earthly father. But I don't need it in the sense that I have a heavenly Father who provides everything for me. And so we see that as we get here, this story of Adam and Eve is really curious that she would add this here. And that she would use the story of Paradise Lost, because there's all of the sympathy towards Adam and towards Lucifer. And basically the implication of that story is like somehow God shortchanged them. And it's the wrong mindset. Has your Father in heaven ever rejected you? No. Not once. Now he has certainly been displeased by some of the things we've done. And justifiably so. A loving father would never permit you to walk into blatant disregard and rebellion and sin. Not because his ego's involved, but because his heart for you is one that he wants you to be what? Fully loved and accepted, fully separated out from the difficulty and the nurturing of this world. And so we see here the creature is now really, really wrestling with this difficulty. Let's fast forward here to the very end of the chapter here on page 137, where the old man has his eyes open, so to speak, even though he was blind. He says, "This great God," exclaimed the old man, "who are you?" At that instant, the cottage door was opened, and Felix, Saphi, and Agatha entered. Who can describe their horror and consternation on beholding me? And again, I want you to hear these words not as somebody who was like, I can't believe that they felt this way. No. These words that are spoken from the creature are inevitable. It's the only way this could have played itself out. And so when he's saying, who can describe their horror, he's saying, like, I can't even begin to tell you how disgusted they were, and rightfully so. Agatha fainted. That's a pretty strong response. And Saphi, unable to attend to her friend, rushed out of the cottage, right? Ran away. Felix darted forward and with supernatural force tore me from his father. Now, get the imagery here. Tore me from who? His father. You notice he doesn't use DeLacy's name, he says his father. His father. Not my father. His father. Not the one that I could have been adopted by, that could be loved. Not the man I was just in relationship with, engaging with, hoping that he would welcome me in. But no. This is not mine to have. This is his father. To whose knees I clung. In a transport of fury, he dashed me to the ground and struck me violently with a stick. I could have torn him limb from limb as the lion rends the antelope. But my heart sunk within me as with bitter sickness, and I refrained. I saw him on the point of repeating his blow when, overcome by pain and anguish, and by the way, I don't think the pain and anguish that's referred to here is the physical kind. That's probably certainly true. But I can speak from experience that there is a pain, and you guys probably know this on some level. There is a pain and an anguish that goes far beyond physical pain. If you've ever lost someone, this is what it's touching upon. That feeling of what next? This like part of your life ripped from you. That struggle. That experience is what he's talking about here. This pain and anguish. I quitted the cottage. Now, again, really, that statement is packed with so much. Because what was the cottage for him? It was home. It was family. It was culture. It was hope. It was the idealized vision of what his life could be. And he had to choose to quit it, to walk away. And in the general tumult escaped unperceived to my hovel. And so we end this part of the story really kind of at this really low point in the life of the creature. Just when it seemed like there may have been some hope, some reprieve, some opportunity, the whole world is yanked out from under him. And again, I don't want to just feel bad for the creature, although we should feel bad. That's an appropriate response. But I want us to be mindful of, in this context, of what we've been given, what you all have been given, what you and I have, is radically different. We've been given a Father who loves us, a Father who will discipline us, a Father who calls us his sons, a Father who's given us his Spirit to do what? To teach us and to guide us, and really to teach us our nature, who we are, truly are, to pull us away from the teachings of this world, the deception of the enemy. We have all of that. And what we need to do is be very, very mindful of the beauty in that and the hope in that. It doesn't mean that you don't have difficulty, that you don't have struggle, that you don't have doubts, that you don't have questions. But what you do have is the same yesterday, today, forever. God's affections towards you are not dependent upon your performance. God's affections for you are constant. And so when you are doing your very, very best, he loves you. And when you're at your very, very worst, he loves you no differently. And that is a hard thing for us to grasp here, because so much of what's been cultivated in our consciousness it's about our behavior. And I think our behavior is important, so don't get me wrong. I think we should always seek to do the right thing. But what's deeper than that really is there needs to be a change at the heart and mind level of doing the things that are hard for us with joy, because we know that our Father wants to bless us. Not with necessarily getting the reward of whatever, because the reward is what? Relationship with him. It's a deepening understanding of who he is, so that as we cultivate that relationship, right, with the Father, being invited into his house to sit at his table, to partake with his sons fully. What the blessing is that we grow more and more and more, because there are days that will come where the enemy will attack full force. And if we understand who we are, what does it matter what the enemy says? You see, for some of us, we still struggle because we've allowed permission for the enemy of our souls to cause us to doubt who we are and what God has given us and whom God has blessed us with. And so if nothing else, what the story of Frankenstein teaches us, it is really, what is it like to be alone? Because I can promise you, none of us here fully knows what it's like to be alone. Because truly being alone means being absent from the Father's love. And there is only one place that becomes a reality. And it's never in the place where our sincere hearts are pursuing him. Ever, ever, ever. The Lord doesn't shut the door on those whom desire him. And so, DeLacy is blind, and he sees so clearly. And unfortunately, his kids come in to open his eyes. And we leave the story now with the creature learning again the painful sting of rejection. And so before we read, and we will read volume 2, chapters 8 and 9 this week, before we read that, we have to ask ourselves this question: how do we think he is going to respond? What do you think the creature is going to do? And so we all had a position of where we think he is at now: creature, monster, demon. Is that going to shift? Let's be mindful of that as we read. This question I want you guys to discuss or journal on is: how should we respond when someone hurts us? How should we respond? Not necessarily how do you respond, although that can be part of that conversation, but how should we respond? And I want us to explore it not from an intellectual understanding. It's not just an exercise on doing the right thing. I want to explore if we know how should we respond, then let's compare that to how do we generally respond, and let's see if there's a difference between the two. And if there is a difference between the two, and I would hazard to guess that generally speaking there is, then I would invite you into some conversations with your parents, with the Lord, around what needs to shift. It might be a mindset. It might be the way my heart is positioned. It might be some judgments that I've had that need to go. It might be, maybe I'm not even looking at myself through really clear lenses, and I need to be reminded of who I am. And let's think of it in terms of this. And I know for you younger ones who are with me earlier, you'll be on this topic anyways. But let's explore it from this mindset that God created mankind in his image and likeness. So what that means is the person who has hurt us is also created in God's image and likeness. And so how do we wrestle with hurting and broken people when they hurt us? There's a saying, I used to use this a lot. We used to talk about this a lot in the work that I did with at-risk teens. It says this: hurt people hurt people. I want you to think about that. Hurt people hurt people. Jesus, by the way, addressed this on the cross. When he prays to his Father, he says this: Father, forgive them. You guys know the end of that? What's the end? Father, forgive them because they don't know what they've done. He took the mindset of they're in ignorance, so forgive them. And he willingly sacrificed himself for the sake of others. And if that is the pattern of Jesus' life, how much more so should we pattern our life around the consideration of giving one another the benefit? This is the revelation for me. A few years ago when my biological father came, he lives in Washington, he came over and he stayed in a lodge, and almost immediately the Lord had me forgive him as if nothing ever happened. And that scripture was really instrumental, because what I realized was I don't need to blame him for a thing. Because he gave me life, certainly, but he doesn't command my destiny. He does not have the whole story of my life in his hand. My biography is not written. Your biography is not written by your earthly parents. They will influence it, hopefully greatly, and hopefully greatly in the right direction. And knowing all of your parents, even Kayla and Caden, I know your parents, they're pretty good. Everyone's parents here's hearts are for you in the right direction. But how much more so your Father in heaven? How much more so does he want to command and author the story of your life to be fruitful, to be one that multiplies in his house with his affection, with his acceptance, and with his love? And with that, we will leave it there and meet next week as we talk about chapters 8 and 9. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.